And that having been said, we will now welcome Pat again for her January visit. This year she is is our program which recognizes Black History Month, and she is following up on the program we had last year by Charity Darrow, who talked about African Americans in Broadway. And today Pat is doing her initial presentation
First time.
of African Americans in Fulks Run. Thank you for being here, Pat. We sure appreciate your coming.
Oh, thanks for having me. I see a lot of familiar faces here, and I know a lot of you have connections with Brock's Gap. So I don't have to tell you that Brock's Gap includes Fulks Run and Bergton and Craters, and sometimes a little bit of a sliver of Hardy County going back toward Matthias area. I'm going to take the microphone off, so hold your ears. All right, and Brock's Gap is noted for its close family ties. Families that settled there in the 1750s and 60s are still there. My mother in the 1960s used to say that everybody was related to everybody else in Brock's Gap except the Scudders and Stainers. They had only been there for 60 years. I grew up working in my parents' grocery store, and I knew a lot of the folks from Brock's Gap and on into Hardy County. I may have been in high school before I knew anybody who was not related to me, either by marriage or by blood. And then, as my son pointed out later, after he lived in New York City, where it's very diverse, then he pointed out that everybody in the Gap looked like everybody else, too. Since I thought I knew all there was to know about Brock's Gap families, it was a surprise to learn that there had been quite a few African American families and individuals living there from the time Rockingham County was formed, and probably before that, until at least the Civil War time. At the first Brock's Gap Heritage Day, 33 years ago, Warren Souter brought me a copy of a land patent from 1813 where a free Negro, that's how it said, a free Negro, Andrew Anderson, was granted land on Crab Run in Bergton in Brock's Gap. Well, that got my curiosity up, but I didn't do any research on that until a couple years ago. In school, I was taught out of the same history books that many of you were, and it turns out that some of those things weren't quite correct, some of the things we learned. For instance, one thing we learned was Rockingham County didn't have that many slaves. Well, yes, the percentage was anywhere from around 15 to 25%, so that is a pretty big number. And then locally, we thought Brock's Gap farms were too poor and too small to support slavery. That wasn't the case either. I found a lot more slaveholders than I thought I would. And then my personal thought was enslaved people were part of the family, and we would always keep the families together and never sell anybody away. That turned out to be wrong too. Now, as I was researching, I found out that words do matter these days. Enslaved people is the term that is used now by researchers instead of slaves to remind us that we're talking about human beings. Slave holders and enslavers is the term that most people use instead of slave owners. And then the old term was mulatto for people of mixed heritage, and now it's mixed or biracial. So I'm going to try to be using these terms, but I'll slip up, I'm sure. Now, my information on the slaveholding families comes from tax and census records. The property tax in the county, personal property tax, every year I look through all those handwritten, unindexed records for this time period to see who was taxed for enslaved people. The slaves were taxed if they were 12 years of age and older, and some years if they were 16 years of age and older. So when you're looking at the tax records, you're only looking at adults, how many adults were in the family. The census records had everybody by age groups. So every 10 years you would find out that there were a lot of children on some of these farms. For the first 20 years that Rockingham County kept records, tax records, there were only 4 Gap families that were taxed for enslaved people. The Humble family, that they were related to the Custers, the Lairs, the Riddles, and the Wetzels. The first 3 families were related by marriage to each other, and they all lived close to the mouth of Brock's Gap around Chimney Rock. The Wetzel family lived between Bergton and Crider's, and as far as I know, they weren't related to the families, to the other 3 families. By 1800 to 1810, there were a lot of slaveholding families, but most of them only held were only taxed for 1 or 2 people. Like the Foley there, that was George Foley, who owned a mill across from Fulks Run Grocery Park. In the census record, there was 1 enslaved person living in his household, but he was never taxed for any enslaved people, so it appears that he was renting the services of a slave. And that was a common practice if you didn't want to support the slaves at your house, or if you wanted a steady stream of income, cash money, then you would rent your enslaved people. And the High family only had 1 or 2 enslaved people for just a couple years, not for decades like some of the other families. And then from the 1830s, you see some of the families are continuing to have enslaved people till the end of the period after the end of the Civil War. And again, some of them only had 1 or 2, and just for a year or 2, like the Cherry Holmes, William Cherry Holmes, one of my ancestors, and Addison Harper, who had married into the Miller family. He only had 1 enslaved person in a census record, and he was not taxed for any. Keep in mind that every X that you see on these charts represents a real person. They had no control over their own lives. They couldn't decide who they were going to marry, where they were going to go, and they couldn't even be guaranteed that they would raise their children to adulthood. Their children and their children's children had the same future of being enslaved for as long as slavery lasted. And then, regardless of how intelligent they were or how hard they worked, they had no opportunity to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. I spent hours going through all these handwritten tax records and added that to my years of knowledge of Brock's Gap families. But even so, I couldn't discover enough names to fill names in, so that's why we have to have a lot of X's. Even on the rest of these families where I did find some names, there's still a lot of unknowns. Let's talk.
Did it give the race? Were they all African American?
As far as race, were they all African American? The records don't specify. You mean could some have been Native American?
Yeah.
The records just say slaves, how many slaves over the age of 12, over the age of 16. And I don't have any family traditions to answer that for anything else. All right, during the talk I'm going to be talking about the white slaveholding families and all the enslaved people that I could find, and then we'll skip to the free African Americans who were in the community. We're starting with Michael Baker. Michael Baker lived in the Riverside Church area of Fulks Run. He was a very wealthy white landowner. He had a store there, he had a large farm, he had a tannery in Georgetown, Maryland, and he owned lots of land even in Greenbrier County. In his lifetime in Rockingham County, I could not find where he was taxed for any enslaved people. He died in 1803, and just a few years after he died, his children and wife evidently started buying enslaved people and bringing them onto the farm. I didn't bring the notebook I wanted to bring, but Michael Baker's store journal still exists, owned by the Historical Society, and it's been transcribed, and a lot of this information I'm going to tell you about Michael Baker came from the store records. His wife bought a Negro girl, is how the records say, in 1817 for $275. I found out later that her name was Peggy Jones. Elizabeth's will freed her when she died in 1824. And the last record I could find for Peggy was in 1827 when her freedom certificate was registered at the courthouse in Harrisonburg. And then Baker's son John freed a man named Bob in 1817, and that was the year that they had sale of the Baker personal property. So they freed Bob at the same time all the other property was liquidated. Two other things about slavery as an institution come out from the Michael Baker estate. One is that, what about the poorer white families that were around? On the Michael Baker estate, they often hired local neighbors to come and help with the reaping and the haymaking and the work in the house and things like that. You see a lot of names in the store journal of the neighbors. But then they started hiring or having enslaved people, and you don't see as many of those local names. So the source of employment for the white people also diminished at that time. And then how it affected slaveholding families too. You know, my family sort of prides itself on hard work, even though we may not do it all the time, but we think we're hard workers. Well, Michael Baker Jr. Married a Turley from Turleytown, and they moved to Greenbrier County, West Virginia. The Turleys were also slaveholders, and Michael Jr. and his wife took their enslaved people with them and had more over there. And later records in that family say that his children became lazy and didn't know how to work, not even how to milk a cow, because their black men and black women always did the work for them. Then moving up to the Criders area, Christian Kaplinger was a large landowner. This picture was taken from Kaplinger Cemetery and Kaplinger Church area and Kaplinger School and on up Germany River. Most of that was owned by the Kaplingers. Christian started having slaves in 1815 in the tax records and had them for 15 more years. By 1830, he had more slaves in his household than anybody else in the Gap, when he had 8 enslaved people, and 5 of them were children under 10. But just 3 years later, in 1833, there's no slaves in his tax record. He moved by 1837 over to Grant County and started a United Brethren church over there. I think it's Mount Hebron. And that the United Brethren were very much against slavery. So what happened to all those 8 people? Did he free them when he joined the church and moved to West Virginia? Or did he sell all of them to finance his move over to West Virginia? I don't know, and I wasn't able to find out. Then there's another mystery in the Kaplinger family. Local historian Louis Yankee wrote in his records that Christian's son Jacob had a daughter with a slave, a girl named Mary Chains, and Mary Chains was born between 1825 and 1830. Well, in the old Kaplinger Cemetery at Criders, here's this handwritten tombstone, and it says, Mary Chains, she died August 8, 1858. I haven't found that name in any census records or any tax records or any free black records for Rockingham County. So that's another mystery that's waiting to be solved. Then we're moving down to the Bergton area, where the Dove family was one of the first families who lived there, and of course you know it was named Dove'sville for a long time. 2 of the brothers of the original Dove settler, Jacob and Frederick, lived around the Lutheran church area, and they were taxed together for 1 to 3 enslaved people for 30 years. But their census records don't show anybody living with them in their household. So I think that they probably were hiring out their slaves to have that income stream. Another researcher of African Americans in Shenandoah County wrote that this was a business venture. Slavery as an institution was a business. And that was one way that it would be a business, by having your steady income. Oh, and that article, the clipping at the top, came from a Harrisonburg newspaper. It says, wanted to hire a black boy between 12 and 15 years of age. That's just to show the illustration that there was hiring going on. Then Jacob and Frederick's brother was George Dove, and he lived in downtown Bergton, about where the Bergton store that recently burned, about where that was located. George
lived right above the current Bergton Elementary School.
Okay, he lived above.
Yes, that is George Dove's
estate, his lands.
Okay, his land extended up to the elementary school.
His house was where, just right next, right above Stuart Wetzel on the other side of the
Okay,
elementary school.
his house right above Stuart Wetzel's. Okay, so that pinpoints where he was. He ran the family mill and he had a lot of land. He also was the high sheriff of Rockingham County for 2 different terms in the 1820s. He first started having enslaved people in 1812, and I think Aaron may have been the first one that he had. And then just a few years later, about 1815, he bought a family consisting of a mother and young children. And we know that because there's a newspaper account of that in a New York newspaper. And we'll get to that in a minute. So in the 1820s, when George became high sheriff, he had to post a big bond because the sheriff's main duty was to collect the taxes. 7 of his family and neighbors went in on the bond, and George also put up 7 slaves as a bond. Well, in his second term, there were some irregularities in collecting the taxes, and he had to sell the slaves to pay off the bond, or to reimburse the county taxes. Samuel Dove, this is a photograph of Samuel Dove, one of George's enslaved people who was sold off. And Samuel became free in New York later on in his life, and he wrote a written account of his life. He said that his father drowned when he was a little boy. When he was 10 years old, he was sold as a slave to George Dove. Samuel didn't remember how long he was at the Doves, but when George had to sell the slaves to pay his debts, he sold Samuel's mother, brother, 2 sisters, and Samuel, and kept 1 sister. So remember that part. 1 sister's going to stay at the Doves. Samuel wrote, "We were torn from each other's arms. I was put up in the market in Richmond. I brought $350, being purchased by a man named Joseph Meek." And there's more details in this article about the rest of his life. We found out about Samuel because in 1865 he advertised in a free black newspaper after the Civil War to see if anybody knew what happened to his mother and his brother and his sisters. He and his brother had been purchased and taken to Nashville, Tennessee, but his mother was left behind at the Eagle Tavern. And that's a drawing of the Eagle Tavern in Richmond about the time that Samuel would have been sold as a slave. This is a picture that tradition says was a slave house at Fulks Run on Millertown Road. George Falk, that was a brother of Christian and Daniel and the second generations of Falks. He owned 1 slave starting in 1835, and then in 1849 there were 2 adult slaves in his household. When George died in 1850, he freed Eliza, Keisha, and her daughter Keisha and her son Alfred, and he left them $50, which was a considerable sum of money at the time. I don't know what happened to Eliza, but I think that she may have died before 1857 because that year her 2 children were bound out or apprenticed to learn a trade, which that usually indicated that the mother was too poor to take care of them or was deceased. Alfred took the surname Vini, which was also the last name of a big free black family over in Page County and all through Rockingham County also. I don't know if he was related to them or just thought that that was a good last name to have. He was first apprenticed to Solomon Hulvey to learn shoemaking, and I'm sure Solomon's related to the Hulveys, like around Rainings Creek and around Broadway. In 1859, though, he was apprenticed to Dr. John Winfield. Remember at Broadway, Dr. Winfield's house along the river? And Winfield was the founder of the Brock's Gap Rifles. So when the Brock's Gap Rifles went to the Civil War, free Alfred Vini went along as a servant for Dr. Winfield. And Dr. Winfield even mentions Alfred in a couple of his letters that he wrote home to his wife. And you can read about it in Virginia Valley Records. Samuel Miller lived at Yankeetown. He was the third generation miller to live in the Shenandoah Valley, and he was also the third generation slaveholder. He came to the Gap about 1837, and he had slaves and was taxed for slaves from then until 1864, when the war was finally over. The Miller family has recalled and saved the names of some of those people. Old Tim was the name of one of them, and Thomas Stewart was the name of another one. They're buried in the Miller's family cemetery. And then the birth records I found for a William and a Harvey, who were born in the 1860s, definitely on Samuel's farm. And then there were others too, but those are the only names that we know. This is a photograph of the Miller family cemetery. The circle shows where the Miller family has remembered that in the cemetery records, that's how it's recorded, that he was a Negro. So Will Stewart, in some newspaper accounts, seemed like a very likable person. He played music, and he played music at the big shindigs up at Yankeetown, and even went to West Virginia to entertain some camps over there. But I don't know anything more about if this is the same William that was born with the Millers. The Riddle family owned a lot of land right around Chimney Rock. The first Riddle in the Gap was John Riddle, although his family had been in the valley for at least 2 generations. John Riddle owned much of the flat land that you see there. This photograph is taken right above Chimney Rock, and his land stretched south along Shoemaker River. John died in 1824, and in his will, he specified that each of the 6 young enslaved people would be given to, each one would be given to one of his children, and he named them by name. So that's how we have all these names for John. Randolph was a slave in the family in the 1790s, and he's not in the will, so I assume Randolph had already died. 3 of John Riddle's sons stayed in the Gap: John H. Riddle, George, and Isaac. John H. Riddle lived down the Hollow Road. He married into the Bird family from Smith Creek, and they were slaveholding family too. So Sarah, the wife of John H., inherited Mary Ann from her father. John H. Riddle inherited Ake from his father. And then for the next 30 years, they were taxed between 3 and 7 enslaved people. And keep in mind, there could have been a lot of children too. Then Isaac Riddle lived further down the Hollow Road on Winfield Lane. This is a picture of his house, probably around 1900, and that's some of the Riddle family standing there. You see that small chimney? The small chimney's still standing, but the rest of the house has been demolished. And you can see from this house that slaveholder families in the Gap didn't follow the stereotype of big brick mansion with 6 columns, 6 white columns, but that was a big house for the Gap. Aaron was the enslaved person that Isaac inherited, and he had some other enslaved people, but they didn't show up in the census records either. So Isaac was also renting out his slaves, it appears. Then in his household in the 1840s and 1850s, Edith Dyer and her son David were in the household. David died in 1859 when he was 13 years old, and his death record says that he was born in Brock's Gap. So I don't know the story of them other than that much information I just gave you. Dyer is a family name from Pendleton County, and one of Isaac's sisters had married a slaveholder named William Dyer in Pendleton, and they lived over there. So I imagine that Edith had some connections in Pendleton. Now on Isaac's farm, tradition in Fulks Run is that the slave cemetery was on the hill behind the house. We went up there 2 years ago, and we did find indications of maybe up to 15 graves up there, maybe even more. Maybe not all African American, there was no way to know. But the current landowner let us put up this monument, and it's African American cemetery, and we have the names of the enslaved people that we know that were on the Riddle farm. And then we always add others, because surely there are some we couldn't identify. And then we also, on the other side, put the names of David Dyer, that we know died on that plantation. And then Also in the death records in 1856 is the name of 5 Vini children who died within months of each other. Some of them were brothers and sisters, some of them were cousins. And the records say that they died in Brock's Gap. I don't know where in Brock's Gap they died or where they've been living, but we put their names and dates on this monument just to preserve their memory. The Trumbo family also lived close to Chimney Rock. If you've heard of Trumbo Ford, that's the general area, and Trumbo Cemetery, right along 259 as you go to Fulks Run, close to elementary school. That land was part of theirs. They'd been in the valley for at least 3 generations. There was Jacob the First, Jacob the Second, and Jacob the Third. Jacob the First came in the 1740s, but I didn't find where he had slaves. Jacob the Second was taxed for several persons for 40 years. One of his slaves was named Jack, and he willed Jack to his son Jacob the Third in 1841. Tradition in the Trumbo family has said that when the Trumbos moved to Illinois, the slaves were free, but they wanted to go with them. And I found out that that was pretty much true. Jacob III sold all of his property in the Gap about 1852-53. He took an older male and Keisha and Henry with them. And we have, again, another newspaper article by Henry Tallman that tells about his life in the Gap, or a little bit, some details. But when the Trumbos moved to Illinois, they stopped in Cincinnati, Ohio, where the Tallmans became free. And then they continued with the family to Ottawa, Illinois, where they were the first black people in the whole county. Martin Wetzel was a very early settler in the Bergton area. His farm, according to Louis Yankee, was sort of behind Louis Yankee's Friendship Park. And he was taxed for 4 to 5 enslaved people very early. Martin died in 1794, and then his wife continued to have enslaved people until her death in 1807. She had a will, but it was burned, and we don't know what happened to her enslaved people. But the names Jim, Dan, and Molly were the names of 3 of them. And then there were free African Americans in the Gap. That surprised me a lot when I first found that out. Some of them had been freed by Gap slaveholders, like George Falk freed Keisha, and the Bakers freed some. And then some were people that moved in for temporary jobs, like shoemaking and things like that. And then there was a free black family, Andrew and Aggy Anderson, who owned a farm on Crab Run and lived in the Gap for about 40 years. We've already talked about Edith Dyer and Samuel Dove. And then we'll go down to Samuel Forrest, or Furry. He and probably his wife and 2 children lived on Crab Run in that neighborhood. In some records, his last name is Forrest, and some last name is Furry. And one year it even says Forrest/Furry. So I guess he was flipping back and forth with his names. In 1847, he had moved outside the Gap, I think around the Peak area. In 1850, I found him in Winchester, where there's a free black community. But in 1857, he disappears from those tax records, and I lost sight of him. John Hubbard was free and living in the Smith Creek area in 1833. In 1832. In 1832, he was arrested for forging a freedom certificate for a man named H.A. Allen, which tells us he could read and write if he could have a forgery. He was sentenced to being burnt in his hand and 25 lashes on his bare back at the public whipping post. He didn't hang around Smith Creek. The next year he was in the Gap, living around, I think, the Raymond's Creek area, based on the names of the neighbors. And he lived off and on in that area. And then in 1850, I think he had moved across the line to Shenandoah County, but it looks like he was still living in the Orkney Spring area, which would be close to Raymond's Creek. And then Sarah Peck was, by tradition, the mulatto slave girl of the Dove family. So this tradition, remember, sort of is verified by Samuel Dove saying that one of his sisters was left behind with the Doves when the rest of them were sold. She must have been very light complected. One census record, her race was put black and it was crossed out and put white. In the next census record, she's white. Subsequent census records, though, her children are usually mulatto, but sometimes they're listed as white. She lived at Bergton. She and Thomas Grove lived together as man and wife for decades in the Grove Hollow area, where close to the Blue Pond. I suspect that Sarah is probably close kin to me. She was probably George Dove's daughter or granddaughter, and that's why he did not put her up on collateral when he made his bond. Don't have any proof of that. That's just what I was thinking. Then John Tarman was a shoemaker in Brock's Gap in 1844. His case shows another bad part about slavery. There was a Virginia law that a child's status depended on whether its mother was free or slave. So John's mother was Nancy, who looked very white, according to a census or according to a court case. She had been enslaved by the Mackle family, but was freed in 1794. Well, some of her children were born when she was a slave, and some of them, like John, were born after she became free. So John was always free, but her first children were slaves and would always be slaves. In 1857, the Roller family took some of her descendants to court because they said they were their slaves. And they said, no, we're not slaves. We're descended from pre-Nancy. We're not slaves. So the main question of this court case was, what's the birth order of the children? Were their direct ancestor Nancy's first children or her last children? Then we come to Andrew and Aggy Anderson. I think they're my favorite people in all Brock's Gap, even over some of my families. And we know more about them than some of the other families in Brock's Gap because there's this big court case after Andrew died. It was over a debt, but a lot of people in the community had to testify, so there's a lot of juicy gossip in this court case too, but a lot of facts. So Andrew first appears in the tax records 1801 around Linville Creek and as a free Negro. So one of the mysteries about him is, was he born free? Did he move here? Was he set free? And same questions for his wife, Aggie, because when they married in 1802, they were both free. Another mystery is, where did Andrew get his money? Because in 1805, now that's just 4 years after he's in the tax records, he contracted to buy a farm for $150, which was a lot of money then. But the seller had lied about the farm size and how good the land was. So Andrew took him to court to sue him to get his money back. But before that case was settled, he bought a 47-acre farm at Crab Run from the Dispany family. So he had extra money, or at least extra good credit, that he could do both those at the same time. He also had enough money to loan 84 pounds of money to John Ritchie, some relation of me, but not very close. And that ended up in a court case too. So Andrew was not afraid to take white neighbors to court. In addition to purchasing his farms, or the 47-acre, he also owned a 100-acre tract. Now, does anybody know where Goose Creek is around Crab Run? That's where Andrew's farm was. So if you know anything about Goose Creek, let me know. I wasn't able to find that on any current maps. So he had his farms. The white neighbors were very complimentary of his skills as a farmer. See that? Now this isn't really a picture of his farm, but I put that on there because of that nice fence. And in the court case, the neighbors complimented him on how well fenced he kept his farm. So that would be an idea of what Andrews would have looked like. They were on a first name basis with their neighbors, and keep in mind some of their neighbors were still speaking German, like Frederick Dove, who loaned him money and bought and sold things to each other. He only spoke German, so maybe Andrew even knew some German words or knew how to speak German. And then they also liked Aggie, and they liked it that Aggie was very thrifty. They said she even had a neat suit of varying clothes to be ready when she went. So she planned ahead too. It's very organized. and she was industrious. She wove linen and sold it at the local stores. And then both of them were very well dressed. Here's a direct quote from one of their neighbors about Aggie. She was as well clothed, better than any person in the neighborhood. So that sort of breaks some stereotypes for me, too. And then in 1837, Andrew would have been up in years some, but they still had financial means to take in a free black boy named Nimrod to teach him how to become a farmer. In their later years, white neighbor Elizabeth Moyers moved in with them to help take care of Aggie when she was sick. Then after Andrew died in 1838, Aggie moved in with my ancestor, Philip Saller, at Crab Run, and he took care of her about 7 years until she died. And then he received her farm as payment for taking care of her. And that was people's solution to nursing home care in those days. The Andersons were held in high regard by the community. Like I said, they were both diligent and industrious. He was a good farmer, and he sold farm produce and shingles at the local store to make money. And together, the two of them had a comfortable life and to dress well. They visited in the neighbors' homes, and the neighbors visited in their homes. The Andersons were the kind of people you'd be glad to call neighbor. I suspect if we could convert more of these X's to names and learn more about the people who were enslaved also, that we would find more people that we would be proud to call neighbor. Maybe someday we will learn more names to change my X's to real people. Now, some of you are probably been wondering about the photograph that's on the cover of my book, and I have it on the internet some places, and this presentation. This is a tintype that came down in 2 different families in Brock's Gap. The older lady is Betty Reedy Babel. Now, of course, with those names, she has strong Brock's Gap roots. I think they actually lived out around the Cedar Run area. The one Joyce Moyer's husband has the picture on the right. And see, it's not quite like the picture on the left that Cook, a shoemaker, had in his collection. The arm's cut off in one of them. So it must have been developed at 2 different times. And here's who the people are. The older lady is Elizabeth Betty Reedy, who married Jacob Babel. And then the middle lady is Jane Babel. And Jane was Elizabeth's daughter after Elizabeth became a widow, but she was born during the 1860s or right after the Civil War. And then the baby in the picture is Jane's daughter, Diana. And they all lived in Cedar Run area. And like I said, the picture came down in these 2 families here. So Cookus was, let's see, his father was a first cousin of Diana, and Cookus's grandmother was half-sister to Jane. I just think it's interesting that they cherish this photograph and it passed down in 2 different branches of the family. Okay, well, that's my presentation for today. Does anybody have any questions? All right. Thank you very much for coming today. I know the weather was pretty iffy sometimes. I want to remind you that donation box right there as you go out if you'd like to throw in something. And then my book is available through the Museum of the African Americans. And we also have the picture book of photographs of Bergton and Crowder's people from 1903. So both those books are available, and I'm sure somebody from the museum would be glad to sell them to you. Thanks very much.
Thank you.